The slavery era represents a very dark period in history that is both difficult to forget and imagine at the same time. During this period, enslaved people were subjected to the most humiliating conditions. They had their rights and liberties taken from them and replaced with untold suffering by cruel masters who had no regard for their existence. Many of the most horrible accounts of events that transpired during the slavery era survive to this date. While some of the horrors they suffered are very well documented, a few others are too grim and commonplace that they often go unreported. These are the stories of untold abuses that enslaved people suffered, and the thought of them can bring you to tears. In this video, we will explore some of these harrowing experiences suffered by enslaved people. But before we proceed, please like and share this video. Also, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications for our channel as well. Thanks, and let's head into the video. History has not been particularly kind to the enslaved black man in the America of old and in several other places that witnessed the slave trade. The pain and suffering of the black man are felt through several horrible stories of their experiences in slavery, and the weight of abuse they suffered is often too heavy to bear. Here are 7 common themes associated with the black enslaved man and the untold abuses they suffered in the past. Number 1. The slave markets. Slavery was a brutal system that was largely built on the dehumanization and debasement of people to mere property. People were forcefully removed from their families in Africa to be sold like goods in bustling markets. Families were torn apart as they watched their loved ones tossed around market stalls, stripped of their identities and helpless against the ongoing humiliation. Imagine having your name erased, your language forbidden, and your culture obliterated, all to render you easier to control. Well, this is precisely what enslaved people suffered in the past, and it was even worse in several other places. The enslaved people were branded with hot irons to mark them as someone else's possession once their price was settled and ownership was confirmed. And so, able-bodied men and women would begin a long and torturous journey to strange lands and climates to start a new oppressive chapter of their lives. Of course, the humiliation did not always follow this script. In some cases, the markets were set up in foreign lands and not on the soil of the captured people. They would often be rounded up, sometimes by their own compromised people, and forced to immediately mount slave ships filled to the brim with their fellow nationals to be transported abroad. After the long and often punishing journey by sea, where some of the men die from hunger or fright and are thrown overboard, they are taken to the slave markets, where they'll be sold to the highest bidder. This is how most enslaved people start their journey, and it mostly does not get any better from this point. Number 2. Deployment. As soon as an enslaved person was bought and their transfer finalized, they would begin their journey back to the home of their new masters. What followed next would set the pace for the future of the enslaved people. First, they would be given new names, often their masters' surnames, and lumped into ramshackle rooms and sheds where they'd spend their nights. They would be deployed into different work settings based on their physical build, gender, or whims of their new owners. In most cases, women were reserved in tending to domestic duties. They would be responsible for cooking, cleaning, caring for their master's children, and tending to the lady in the house. The men, especially the able-bodied ones, often had a more difficult fate. They were condemned to a lifetime of hard work on sprawling plantations, fields, and factories where they worked long hours under challenging conditions. They would often be stationed over vast swaths of cultivable land where they were made to toil the land with basic tools. In those days, cotton fields, rubber fields, and other cash crop plantations were primarily populated by black men and a few women, especially in the Deep South. and as they worked to no end, their oppressors would wait over them, whip in hand to lash out at any worker that tried as much as stop for a minute to catch their breath. This was no ordinary work field. It was a trap and a hard place where men were stripped of their dignity for zero reward. Those deployed to work in factories did not have it any better. They would be supported with basic tools to do work that machines should have done. From plastic and metal working factories to lumber workshops, black men and women toiled away every day with no respite in sight. After every other hard day at the fields and factories, they would return home to face new difficulties, as you'll see next. Number 3. Physical, psychological abuse and torture. From the factories to the fields and finally at home, enslaved people faced the most intense form of physical and psychological abuse and torture. The physical torment inflicted upon enslaved people by their masters and minders was relentless and brutal. The punishments for perceived infractions ranged from brutal lashings to mutilations that left permanent scars. In many cases, the crimes did not match the severity of the punishment. Enslaved people who stole a piece of biscuit could be severely whipped, and those who did worse could be sent to prisons where they stayed long under very harsh conditions. The crack of the whip and the clang of iron restraints echoed through plantations, instilling terror in the hearts of the enslaved. Torture devices were commonplace, designed to inflict maximum pain and ensure compliance. Iron masks, spiked collars, and leg irons were among the implements of torment wielded by merciless overseers, each one serving as a testament to the cruelty of the institution. The systematic oppression of the black enslaved people in slavery-era America also took a psychological toll on the victims. This psychological toll was staggering, with enslaved individuals subjected to constant fear and manipulation. The threat of violence hung over them like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over every aspect of their lives. Gaslighting and psychological abuse were wielded as weapons to break their spirits and maintain control. Many enslaved people struggled with feelings of worthlessness and despair after being forced to internalize their pain and suffering. The psychological scars of slavery ran deep, leaving lasting trauma that cannot always be spoken of or quantified. Number 4. Sexual exploitation and abuse. Enslaved women and girls were victimized twofold for the most part. Not only did they painfully endure the physical brutality of slavery, but they also experienced firsthand the horrors of sexual exploitation. Many of the enslaved women were raped by their masters and overseers at different times, and the victims were powerless to resist or seek justice. To have the slave women to themselves, the white men would send their husbands out to the fields and then defile their wives before they returned. The system was rigged against them, and no juror would entertain a plea made on behalf of an enslaved person at the time. The hapless women and young girls were forced to lick their wounds after every brutal episode, waiting helplessly for history to repeat itself without fail. Their bodies were treated as commodities to be used and discarded at whim. Forced breeding was another ugly aspect of slavery, with women forced to bear children for profit. Their reproductive autonomy was stripped away, leaving them trapped in a cycle of abuse and exploitation. Women were constantly forced against their will to add to the supply of enslaved people in households. And because the law did not accord enslaved people born of white men to be free, the white masters often had their fill of the women at any time, often in a bid to produce offspring that would add to the household's slave population. At a time, it was recorded that Virginia had over 44,000 mixed-race enslaved people around 1850, the most of any southern state at the time. While women were mainly at the receiving end of the sexual violations, the men also had their fair share. Black men were molested at work and at home by white men and women. Some men were even taken as sex slaves, called upon to satisfy their masters, or in many cases, the mistresses. In those dark times, women were violated for fun sometimes and for specific purposes at other times. It was the practice then for the white woman of the house to hire wet nurses, newly nursing slave mothers who were uprooted from their babies to nurse their mistresses' babies, sometimes with their breast milk. Enslaved men would be forced to impregnate their female counterparts, so there was always an endless supply of nursing women all year round in the wet nurse market. Number 5. Economic exploitation. Slavery was not just a moral abomination, it was also a profitable enterprise that was built on the exploitation of human labor. The slave trade was not only practiced on the shores of Africa, it also made its way to foreign lands. White enslavers traded on enslaved people like they did domestic goods. They often sold enslaved people whom they considered to be unproductive, either by their inability to bear children or work long hours in the cotton fields. Whenever an enslaver was in debt, they could sell off their slaves or lease them to offset their debts and reclaim these enslaved people when they had fully settled their debts. At the time, the wealth and standing of a white man or woman were often determined by the number of slaves they had. Enslaved men and women were also forced to toil under grueling conditions, creating immense wealth for their owners, while receiving little to no compensation in return. Plantation owners amassed vast fortunes on the backs of enslaved laborers, thus creating a system of economic inequality that persists to this day. The particularly lucrative cotton industry was fueled by slave labor, which helped drive economic growth in the antebellum South. Enslaved workers picked cotton from dawn till dusk, enduring backbreaking labor under the scorching sun. Their contributions were essential to the region's economic prosperity, yet they were denied the fruits of their labor, living in abject poverty and deprivation. Away from the fields, enslaved people did several other tasks that yielded rich rewards for their masters. Whether it was their work in production factories or construction fields and mines, they toiled endlessly at the behest of greedy overseers and masters. When the rewards of their toil were collected and distributed, they were mainly never considered to partake in it. They could not complain and would go home knowing it was just another day in their very difficult life. This was the unfortunate fate of the enslaved man in slavery-era America, and it was an endless tale of exploitation and debasement. Number 6, legal and political oppression. While slavery was mostly upheld by brute force in those days, it was also enshrined in law. Governments passed legislation to maintain the institution and defend the interests of slaveholders, and it was mostly always at the expense of the enslaved people. The enslaved people were denied fundamental human rights and legal protections and treated as property under the law. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, for example, compelled citizens to assist in the capture and return of runaway slaves. The brutal act served to effectively strip free states of their sovereignty and spread the reach of slavery into every corner of the nation. Enslavers used these legal mechanisms and provisions to commit untold horror on their slaves, knowing fully well that they would not be held to account. In those days, members of the discriminatory white supremacist Ku Klux Klan conspired to bar America's jury system from fielding any black person in their ranks. So with no peer of theirs on the bench and bar, there was nobody to defend the rights and plead the grievances of enslaved people. It was a very difficult fate that they had no other option but to live with. The same KKK group joined with several other discriminatory groups and people to push for the disenfranchising of enslaved black people in a series of laws known as the Black Code. To this end, black enslaved people were barred from voting and occupying any political positions in the land. It was passed by law in many American states at the time that black people of slave descent could not hold office or contest for any political position across the board. This effectively placed the people at a grave disadvantage on all fronts. With no political representative to push for their rights or juror to entertain their pleas, enslaved people were faced with a bleak future. Number 7, cultural erasure and resistance. The institution of slavery did way more than exploit the labor of enslaved individuals. It also attempted to erase the cultures and identities of the enslaved people. First, these people were forcefully removed from their native lands, where they spoke their native languages and practiced their native religions, customs, and traditions. They were then transported to strange lands where they met a rude awakening and shock in the new way of life, totally different from what they were initially accustomed to from birth. All around America and in several other places, enslaved people were forbidden from practicing their native religions. They were barred from speaking their languages or celebrating their cultural traditions. This systematic erasure served to dehumanize them further, rendering them as little more than labor units to be exploited. Black nursing mothers would not be allowed to speak in their native language to their growing children, at least in the presence of their masters. And so it was that these masters succeeded in breaking the bridge that linked generations of shared cultures and values. They believed that by stripping their slaves of their native identities and culture, it would be easier to break them and give them new identities of their choosing. It was also a subtle and systematic way of breaking down their core and soul to make them even less dignified in preparation for all the horrors they would face. Despite these efforts, enslaved people seemed to find ways to preserve their cultural heritage and resist assimilation. Through music, dance, storytelling, and other cultural expression, they asserted their humanity and forged bonds of community and solidarity. These acts of artistic resistance were a testament to the resilience and spirit of enslaved people in the face of overwhelming oppression. These 7 points sum up the brutal experiences that enslaved people faced at the hands of their masters and oppressors in the slavery era. They were subjected to the most inhumane living conditions and treated as mere property by their masters. Black women were constantly defiled at the wish of their white masters, and the men were not left out either. The men toiled endlessly and without reward at plantations, and came home to a trail of lamentations from the people they left behind. Many of these stories are too difficult to carry and pass over generations, so they may have been lost amid several narratives. But the little that we know now and then tells us that the slavery era was indeed a brutal and unforgiving period for Black enslaved people. The wounds are still healing in many places that witnessed the horrors, and the scars remain as a lasting reminder of the lowest point in our collective humanity. This is where we end today's video. We hope you have learned a thing or two from today's video, and we look forward to having you when we next roll out a new video. Please like and share this video if you haven't done so yet, and then subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our interesting videos. See you next time.